So, you know Reddit. Everyone knows Reddit, for better or for worse. But despite the site's more interesting subreddits, some of the communities here are utterly enriching. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I quite like r/poetry. Don't get me wrong, it has a lot of problems. Oftentimes I wish there were less dunking on bad poems and more propping up great poems. Not to mention there's often an air of pretentiousness among some Redditors. Of course, with both of those critiques, it's sort of the pot talking to the kettle, isn't it? I get it, man. Engagement is engagement. But for all its faults, r/poetry has introduced me to some really awesome poems, poets, and discussions. If there's one thing everyone on the subreddit has in common, it's that they love poetry. Of course, everyone loves poetry in different ways, and that's great, but it creates sort of an interesting mix of top-rated poems. For example, with 7.9 thousand upvotes, this is apparently the best poem on r/poetry. Piece of Shit by Sam Pink. When I see a frog and it takes a hop away from me, it's like, what the fuck, man? So I've actually mentioned this poem in a previous video, but let's talk about it a little more in depth. On the surface, this reads like insta poetry. It shares a lot of characteristics with the genre that many poets despise, and that comparison isn't just surface level. However, the poem did make me laugh, and that's more emotion than most insta poetry has elicited from me. So yeah, the main selling point here is the humor, and it is funny, I give Sam Pink that much, and many commenters on Reddit were playing into the joke, basically rewriting the poem as was relevant. That being said, the humor is arguably the least interesting part of this poem. It's probably what pulls you in and introduces you to the work, but if you choose to stay inside, you might find something more. This poem goes beyond the sphere of most insta poetry in giving some amount of depth and potential meaning. For example, take a look at this poem by Rupi Kaur. If you are not enough for yourself, you will never be enough for someone else. There's really not much more to say there besides what's literally being said, and in my mind, that doesn't make for effective poetry. As I've said before, good poetry stays with you. It lingers. It gives you more to consider than what's solely on the page. And if you choose to stay with Sam Pink's poem a little longer, you might find that. Pink's poem is more than just words spelling out a moral. It presents us with two characters, the speaker and the frog, and two actions, the hopping away and the speaker's reaction. So on the surface, that's what's literally happening. A frog is jumping away from the speaker, and the speaker reacts negatively. But is there more to it than that? Well, a lot of Redditors seemed to think so. For example, this deleted user commented, "I love this poem. It reminds me of the pettiness and self-pity I can wrap myself in sometimes, as if the car that cut me off was an act of personal insult or something. This wonderful little poem allowed me to laugh at myself." In other words, this reader interpreted the poem as an examination of self-importance or self-pity. The speaker thinks that the frog jumping away is an action that happened to them, when in reality, it was just something that happened. When we're going through hard times, it can be easy to make everything about us. Without realizing it, we get hit with a case of main character syndrome. A poem like this reminds us to step back and analyze events as things that happen and not things that happen to us. Another commenter on Reddit imposed a more environmental message onto the poem. Why is the frog jumping away? It is within its nature, but I look at him because I want to see nature, which does not seem to want me near it. Why can I not be a part of that frog that interests me? Why is he fleeing? I guess although we rule over nature, it will always flee from us if it has a chance, since we are a danger to it. The frog jumping away reminds us of our own position in nature, which we forget about most of the time. You might argue that these interpretations are reading way too much into the poem, but that's kind of my bread and butter around here. And at least Pink presents a poem that allows itself to be read into. And as a challenge, I invite you, my dear viewer, to try and read into this Rupi Kaur poem here. Feel free to prove me wrong and show me how much is going on under its surface. Another commenter compared the poem to art of the Dada movement. For more on that, be sure to check out my Spider-Verse video, but in short, as Ira Piller wrote for the Salvador Dali Museum, Dadaism was the anti-art movement. Dadaism's main purpose was to challenge the social norms of society and purposefully make art that would shock, confuse, or outrage people. It thrived on counterattacking everything that was conventional in society. So yeah, this poem is Dadaist in the sense that it challenges poetic conventions and creates confusion or outrage in general poetry readers. Does it challenge poetic conventions in a way that's new or interesting? That's debatable. I'd say no, especially compared to other poets both past and present. Of course, a lot of Redditors recognize that the poem is just silly, and that there's a place in literature for such silliness. It might not stand the test of time necessarily, but it brings a smile to my face, and that's worth something, even if momentarily. The next top poem has 6.2k upvotes, which is over 1,000 less than Sam Pink's. It comes to us from one of our favorite authors here on the channel, Shel Silverstein. This poem is called Masks. She had blue skin, and so did he. He kept it hid, and so did she. They searched for blue their whole life through, then passed right by and never knew. I don't think it's hard to see why this poem appeals to a wide audience. Both the text and drawing have all the same charms as pretty much any Silverstein poem. There are surreal and comedic elements, but it also tugs at the heartstrings. As far as interpretations and morals go, the most obvious would probably be just be yourself. Since both parties are hiding who they truly are, they miss out on the connection to commune. If we look further under the surface, we might also ask why these subjects wear masks in the first place. Why did they keep their blue skin hidden? And perhaps the answer seems obvious. They were probably bullied. People probably pointed and stared, and the subjects were tired of it. So on a deeper level, this poem also says something about how we treat those who are different from us and the ripple effects that treatment can cause. Those are the thoughts that most immediately jumped out to me, and a lot of Redditors agreed. As this commenter wrote, "Be yourself, because you never know when trying to please or fit a role will have you miss out on a real connection. Being true to yourself will make you the happiest." Other commenters, however, applied even more personal sentiments. This one wrote, "I know it isn't about this, but this resonates with me as an autistic woman who heavily masks/camouflages my autism. Even relate to the blue skin because I've always felt like an alien. I sometimes wonder how many fellow aliens I could have befriended if I wasn't trying to hide myself." Another user wrote, "This is what it was like being gay in the Midwest in the 80s. After reading these interpretations, I couldn't help but be reminded of Judith Butler. In her book Gender Trouble, Butler argues that everything we do is a performance, including gender. She wrote, "If gender attributes and acts, the various ways in which a body shows or produces its cultural signification, are performative, then there is no pre-existing identity by which an act or attribute might be measured. As we act, we have no pre-existing identity. Rather, our culture creates identities based on attributes and acts. In the context of the poem, we can assume that society creates identities for these subjects based on their blue skin. As such, they were desperate to perform other identities and ultimately missed out on kinship." Is there a trans reading of this poem? Frankly, yeah, I think there is. We can see it as two closeted trans individuals trying to perform the roles assigned to them at birth. And since they're putting up these masks, they don't realize that there are other people out there experiencing the same thing. Nowadays, the internet has the potential to help people feel seen and validated. And I of course have to give a shout out to the teachers who are teaching trans kids that their identity is valid. But not so long ago, there were probably plenty of trans youth who wondered if they were just abnormal, who wondered if their experience was isolated. Of course, I'm not a trans individual, and as always, I invite you, the audience, to let me know if anything I say is off the mark. I feel that this poem would especially resonate with teenagers, since perhaps more than anyone, teens wonder if anyone in the world might be like them. That's why there's a certain genre of meme that used to really resonate with young millennials and Gen Z. Stuff like, "Admit it, you've tried to close the fridge slowly to see when the light turned off." It's comforting for young people to know that they're not as weird as they think they are. Personally, as a young person, I was extremely nervous about being normal and fitting in. Eventually, I learned it was just cooler to have blue skin. On that note, I thought another Redditor had an interesting link here. They mentioned the Japanese concepts of hone and tatemae. As Jasmine Ortlieb wrote for Jobs in Japan, hone is one's true feelings and thoughts, which are revealed to only one's family or close confidants. For most situations, however, tatemae is used, which is a pleasant, although superficial surface-level way of communication. Ergo, hone is me at home, whereas tatemae is me at my customer service job. So, the ideal is that one day I might quit my customer service job so I can be the person I feel like I am all of the time. Unfortunately, sometimes life requires that we wear a lot of masks.
We all wear masks, Spider-Man. But which one is real? The one that hides your face, or the one that is your face?
But amid the funny stuff and the worthy morals, there are also some deep, heavy, important messages in r/poetry. Our next poem was posted 2 years ago, but feels more relevant today than ever. With 5.7k upvotes, this is the third most popular poem in the subreddit. It's called A Reminder by Mahmoud Darwish. The war will end, the leaders will shake hands, the old woman will keep waiting for her martyred son, that girl will wait for her beloved husband, and those children will wait for their heroic father. I don't know who sold our homeland, but I saw who paid the price. Mahmoud Darwish was a Palestinian poet. As per the Poetry Foundation, Darwish was born in Al-Birwa in Galilee, a village that was occupied and later razed by the Israeli army. I highly recommend reading his full bio on the Poetry Foundation site, but here are some highlights. He wrote over 30 books of poetry and 8 books of prose. He was arrested for going between villages without a permit, reciting poetry along the way. One of his poems, Identity Card, was turned into a protest song. For such reasons, Darwish was considered a resistance poet. Darwish is also notable for writing the Palestinian Declaration of Independence. Darwish's poem here does indeed serve as a reminder, just as the title suggests, but it's not a gentle reminder, it's tragic, you might even call it angry. It paints a contrasting picture between those who start and facilitate wars and those who actually die in wars. Today the situation in Gaza isn't a war, since Gaza is an occupied territory and doesn't have a standing army, but Darwish's poem is still just as relevant. The men and women currently propagating the conflict are not the ones who will truly pay the price for it. We see those who are paying the price, even though the media and the White House would have you ignore them. And the families of those who paid the price? They will keep waiting and waiting. One Redditor reworded the condemnation against those in power, saying that if presidents and prime ministers had to fight in the conflicts they started, war would never occur. It's hard not to feel the anger and heartbreak that Darwish is trying to communicate. As I mentioned, I normally don't love poetry that's super straightforward, and while there is more technical depth here than in other short, straightforward poems, it's not hard to get the poem's message. It's very upfront. But when the message is, on its face, so heartbreaking and important, sometimes uncomplicated, undemanding language is the way to go. As long as we're talking about important messages, I do want to read one more poem. It's the 4th most popular on r/poetry with 5,500 upvotes. I have to issue a content warning, this next poem does deal with taking one's own life, but even if that subject matter is potentially triggering for you, I think this poem might be valuable to you. This is a prose poem called The Morning After I Killed Myself by Meggie. The morning after I killed myself, I woke up. I made myself breakfast in bed. I added salt and pepper to my eggs and used my toast for a cheese and bacon sandwich. I squeezed a grapefruit into a juice glass. I scraped the ashes from the frying pan and rinsed the butter off the counter. I washed the dishes and folded the towels. The morning after I killed myself, I fell in love. Not with the boy down the street or the middle school principal. Not with the everyday jogger or the grocer who always left the avocados out of the bag. I fell in love with my mother and the way she sat on the floor of my room, holding each rock from my collection in her palms until they grew dark with sweat. I fell in love with my father down at the river as he placed my note into a bottle and sent it into the current. With my brother, who once believed in unicorns, but who now sat in his desk at school trying desperately to believe I still existed. The morning after I killed myself, I walked the dog. I watched the way her tail twitched when a bird flew by or how her pace quickened at the sight of a cat. I saw the empty space in her eyes when she reached a stick and turned around to greet me so we could play catch, but saw nothing but sky in my place. I stood by as strangers stroked her muzzle, and she wilted beneath their touch like she did once for mine. The morning after I killed myself, I went back to the neighbor's yard, where I left my footprints in concrete as a 2-year-old, and examined how they were already fading. I picked a few daylilies and pulled a few weeds, and watched the elderly woman through her window as she read the paper with the news of my death. I saw her husband spit tobacco into the kitchen sink, and bring her daily medication. The morning after I killed myself, I watched the sun come up. Each orange tree opened like a hand, and the kid down the street pointed out a single red cloud to his mother. The morning after I killed myself, I went back to that body in the morgue and tried to talk some sense into her. I told her about the avocados and the stepping stones, the river and her parents. I told her about the sunsets and the dog and the beach. The morning after I killed myself, I tried to unkill myself, but couldn't finish what I started. The operative device here is the imagery. it's easy for the reader to put themselves in the poem, and intentionally so. It's pretty clear the message that Royer intends to impart, the sanctity and beauty and joy of life. Looking through the comments on this one, many people shared their own experiences related to the poem. In fact, it may not seem like it, but all of the poems we looked at today had something to say about humanity. I might even go as far as to say they all say something about the sanctity and beauty and joy of life. Of course, that depends on how deeply you read into them, but like I said, that's sort of my MO. And as I've said many times before, all literature is about what it means to be human. And for one more repeat quote, I'll say everyone loves poetry in different ways. Frankly, there's no wrong way to enjoy poetry. So, which poems here clicked with you? What did you think of the Redditors' tastes and interpretations? Please tell me everything. And hey, before you go, check out this poem from one of my patrons. This poem is called Dawn Tide by Marcus Cosma. Feet in the brine, licks of the flaming horizon, scarlet edge, falling willows at the purple-orange skyline, wet paper tears in the twilight dawn, whispers in the shrouded corners, and in my wet paper hands is the rusted star, what I hope was, but no longer is. As I kneel into the salt slick light, I open willow branches, carrying the star to the sea. For the chance to showcase your writing at the end of my videos, or if you just like what I do and want to support me, feel free to donate to my Patreon. You'll also receive access to the community Discord, early access to videos, and priority review over on the second channel. Subscribe over there if you want. I genuinely can't thank my patrons enough for their support. If you want to support the channel in other important ways, liking, commenting, and subscribing really goes a long way. You can also follow me on Instagram to see what I'm reading, and Twitter for whatever else. Thanks for watching, and ultimately, keep in mind, this is a rough draft.